Before 1912, there was a very small group, what they would have called a circle, of the IRB. The IRB was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and it was a secret organisation, so it's very hard to know exactly how many people were members of it. And then with the foundation of the Ulster Volunteer Force, the response was to the foundation of the Irish Volunteers, the Nationalists, in late 1913. And by about February 1914, the Irish Volunteers were beginning to be organised in Derry and through Inishowen. Many of them were actually reservists in the British Army or had served in the British Army. So there was a very strong British Army element in the Irish Nationalist Volunteers. These two organisations, the Irish Volunteers, the Ulster Volunteers, were on the verge of civil war over the Home Rule issue in the run-up to the summer of 1914. But then the First World War breaks out, and that of course changes the picture completely. And there was a split in the Irish volunteer movement. John Redmond, who had acquired control of them, advocated them joining the British Army, and a smaller group within the volunteers rejected that and said, no, we don't fight Britain's wars for them. So they pulled away. Once the First World War began in August the 4th, 1914, the IRB decided that they would use the opportunity of the war to mount or to hold a revolution, a rising. So they began planning straight away for this rising.
John had gone and joined the British Army in 1915, I would say about October 1915. 21st of January 1916 he was killed. He'd only been 3 months in the army. When Manassas received the telegram telling him of his son's death, he threw it into the fire and said he will never be spoken of again. Now, there's two sides to that story. One side of the family say he was utterly ashamed of his son for joining the British Army. And the other side of the family said he was heartbroken. As I understand it, Redmond encouraged people to join the British Army so that it would help to free a small Catholic country, Belgium, and also eventually in the long run help the Home Rule case for Ireland. And I think that's why John went and joined the army. But unfortunately, he lost his life and it didn't do any good for Home Rule either.
Two brothers, George and Neil Doherty, were from the Lecky Road originally, and they both joined up and served in France 1914-15. Neil unfortunately was killed in 1915. George was badly wounded. He came back here, and whatever he saw when he was in hospital in France, he said he swore there was a heaven and a hell, because he'd seen them both. He died quite young, because I remember my mother saying she remembers going to his wake in Chamberlain Street, and she was only an infant at the time.
As different periods of conflict happened, like, for example, 1968 when the civil rights started, she talked a lot about what it was like back then. She talked a lot about Cumnaban and Countess Markievicz, and the reason why she knew so much about her, a lot of the teachers in the Long Tower School then were members of the Cumnaban, and their side of working for the rising was to inform the children and make sure that they knew, they're aware of all that was happening, and our history and the Irish language. They weren't allowed to teach those things in school, so they started and gave lessons earlier than the official school time in the morning. So if you were interested in coming, you could come to those lessons. And that's where my mother got most of her nationalist background, I would say.
Sarah was born in 1884. She went on to become the organising secretary of the Derry branch of the National Union of Tailor and Garment Workers, and was so vociferous that she was denounced off the altar and told not to come to Mass. But she came anyway. She just went anyway. She didn't care. So she obviously had very strong socialist views, and there's still, right down through the years, there's still evidence of her working in the trade union. She's mentioned in theses. I have a photograph of her standing in Chipkey Street in the 1920s, supporting a strike that's been held by the Tailor and Garment Workers Union. She was looking for better conditions, better money and better working conditions for women particularly, because from what I've read at that time, apart from the wages not being great, women were also paid less than the men in the factories, and all of Derry was paid less than what was paid in England in a similar factory. She was denouncing the factory owners and managers and looking for better conditions. Two of her uncles, or cousins, were managers of the factories. So she was fighting her own family almost.
People like Joseph O'Doherty were both members of the IRB and the volunteers. And Joseph, for instance, was very much involved in obtaining arms. They obtained arms in lots of ways. We know, for instance, that a lot of soldiers would literally sell weapons, steal the weapons and sell them for drink money, you know. There's a particular case of a large consignment of ammunition being stolen from the Ebrington barracks by the volunteers during a recruitment rally for the First World War. So there was all that sort of thing going on.
My father trained as a teacher. He went to St. Colum's in Derry, and he was an altar boy and loved it. And I have a picture of him at the blessing of the steeple about 1905 as a wee boy. We went to Dublin to be trained, and he was trained in St. Patrick's, and that led him right into everything that was happening in Dublin at the time. I had an uncle already there, Seamus O'Doherty. He was already in the IRB in 1913, and he enrolled my dad in it. The whole of the city was bubbling with animation and talk, you know, just as certainly their family in Derry had been. You see, they had gone through the loss of Parnell and the pain it was, and they were all Parnellites and so on. And they were full of the story of our history. And, you know, they definitely were nationalists. My father's first association with Padraig Pearse was in his mind. You see, he was reading what Pearse was writing, and it actually animated him. Something that was in accord with what he had in his own heart, and about education, about the right to be oneself, about the history of our own language. He was with Pearse down in Kilcool at the gun running that Pearse was in charge of, and so that brought him close to something was going to happen.
The story at a local level is more just kind of training and organising and all that. But then, if you like, in Dublin, at the headquarters of the IRB, a small, very small group called initially the Military Committee, then the Military Council, planned the rising. And I mean, it's like a set of Russian dolls. There's, you know, secret groups within secret groups within secret groups. And of course, ultimately, that's going to also cause confusion because so few people really know what's going on.
My grandfather had a business running taxis from sheds that used to be part of Watt's Distillery on Abbey Street. These sheds faced on to William Street, where the city baths are now. But the shed was also used as a meeting place for the Fianna, the ARB, in the time run up to 1916, the Rising. And it was used for storing guns. The guns had been ordered as machine parts, labelled machine parts, and came in through Derry Quay in preparation for the Rising.
By Wednesday, the Wednesday of Holy Week, Joseph comes to Dublin on a trip to see his girlfriend. But one of his friends is Sean McDermott, who's ultimately going to be one of the signatories of the proclamation and one of the people who's executed. He calls in to see McDermott, who's in his office in Delir Street in Dublin. And McDermott quizzes him first of all about why he's in. What are you doing here in Dublin? Like, you know, have you heard something? And Doherty said, "No, just come see my girlfriend."
And he said, "Did you hear anything?" And my father said, "No, anything of importance?" He said, "No." And then he took him into another room at the back, that he says he describes it. And he swore me again into the IRB, very solemnly. They shook hands. And he said, "We're going to strike on Sunday." And that's the first that he heard of it. And he said, "I'm glad I'm up here, because I'd be in the middle of it."
And Doherty is sort of semi-delighted, because this is something he's trained for and prepared for all his life. But McDermott said, "But I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to stay in Dublin. You've got to go back to Derry and, you know, get involved in things there."
And they had talked about arms that was up in Derry that that he knew about. Take back those arms and get your brother, Seamus, to go with you and bring back some of those arms to Dublin, and you stay in Derry. And I don't think that he was pleased that he had to stay in Derry. Seamus did come back on Easter Saturday to Dublin with 2 cases of small arms. So that part of it was delivered, and that the rest were kept for Derry.
Joseph is, if you like, preparing for things in Derry, but he doesn't tell anybody yet. He's the only one in Derry at this stage that knows there's going to be an Easter Rising. He was allowed by Sean McDermott at 9 o'clock on Saturday night to tell the other volunteers. I think the meeting was actually in a shop, Charlie Breslin's shop in William Street in Derry, and they meet, and he explains that there's going to be a rising the following day in Dublin, and they'll get orders to what they're supposed to do.
On the night that they were to mobilise for the Rising, 17 of them had met up in my grandfather's shed with 2 days' rations, their heaviest top coat and whatever guns and homemade bombs they could muster. And they were gathered in the shed, and 2 policemen came up and stood outside the shed at a lamppost, totally unaware that there was 17 guns trained on them from inside. And eventually they walked off, and then the order came through from McNeill to stand down, and the Rising was postponed, and it was only happening in Dublin, so the guns were shipped to Dublin at that stage. I don't know if they would have been planning to attack the military base at Ebrington, which is a bit ironic, because that's where my other grandfather had been stationed when he was sent here in the British Army.
There had been a whole row in Dublin about the secrecy of the Rising. And Owen McNeill, who was in charge of the Irish Volunteers, by Holy Saturday that weekend, he felt there's no possibility of success. And he famously issued what's called the countermand. Joseph O'Doherty was to meet up at 9 o'clock on Easter Sunday morning with Seamus Kavanagh, who was the officer in command of the Irish Volunteers in Derry. They were to meet on the quays behind the Guildhall. But on the way down from his own house in Craigan Street, down William Street, he goes into Charlie Breslin's shop and he buys a copy of the Sunday Independent. And there in the Sunday Independent is the publication of The Countermand. The rising was planned to actually originally to break out at 6 o'clock in Dublin on Easter Sunday. But because of the Countermand and all the confusion, it didn't happen. But Patrick Pearson, people like that, then took the decision to start at noon on Monday. There's no community, there's no radio, there's virtually no telephones, in those days. So really everyone is operating on rumours. Easter Tuesday morning, a message comes from a Dr. McCartan, Pat McCartan. He was a very senior Republican. He was a member of the Supreme Council of the IRB, so he was really a kind of, close to things. And he sends a message to Derry saying, hold everything, don't do anything until Thursday. And of course, by Thursday, the authorities have got wind of the whole thing, and they're arresting everybody. And in Derry, about 9 volunteers are arrested and picked up, and eventually they're brought up to the internment camp in Frongoch in Wales.
It broke my father's heart that he, I can't say it without thinking of how much he cared. It broke his heart to think that after all the thing, that the whole thing had collapsed, that he hadn't really taken part in it, that he didn't get the chance to fight and to die for Ireland.
Some notes from my grandfather Magdalene's diary of 1916 when he actually mentions the Sinn Féin revolt on the 24th of April. He actually has it Easter Monday, 24th of April, Sinn Féin revolt in Dublin. And then he writes, cuckoo cries on a leafless tree, a bad omen, an evil omen. So that was on the 24th of April. And then on the 25th he has written, no communication with Dublin today, awful rumours. So he obviously kept contact with what was going on. And then on the 30th, which is a week later near enough, he says Sinn Féin revolt over, awful massacre, miserable failure. Sinn Féin leader shot on the 3rd of May. So, that is what he's made that. And then on the next breath he has written, I hired Sissy McChrystal for £4.10, and I sowed my flax today. And then his daughter was born. His daughter was born in June. Rosemary was born in a hurry this morning at home. And Rosemary was baptised today. And then he was putting the finishing touches to the spuds. So that's kind of roughly what was going on in his life in 1916.
1916, my father would have been about 7, the IRB. They would have been planning tactics. The boys would have been running the air and taking the messages and making sure everybody got the message, delivering the messages and delivering the meat. because you can picture a butcher's and you had to deliver the meat. But I think that the two were sort of tied up together because he was out and about and he was able to do a lot of special deliveries, more than meat.
There's only one person in Derry that we know about who's actually arrested in Dublin during the Rising. And of all things, a man called David Norrie. He was General Secretary of the Apprentice Boys. Very interesting. He'll be like a loyalist, but he just happens to be caught up in all the hoo-ha in Dublin. A new branch of the Apprentice Boys was to be set up in Dublin that Easter weekend. And he just gets caught up in all the hostilities. But he's arrested on Thursday by a group of the Enniskillings, and he gave his address as the Memorial Hall, Society Street, Londonderry, but after about 10 days he's released. The only Derry person who's actually killed in the Easter Rising is Second Lieutenant Charles Crockett. He'd gone to Foyle College and then he went to a medical student in Queen's University, Belfast. And he'd signed the Ulster Covenant against Home Rule and all those kinds of things. But when the war broke out, then he became an officer in the British Army. And he was accidentally shot by his own side, actually, by a private in the Dublin Fusiliers. It was a tragic mistake, but he was shot on Thursday of Easter week. And he's the only Derry person who was killed in the Rising. William Mackay was a rather well-known Protestant working-class public figure, you know, in the city. He was a member of the corporation, and he was one of the founders of Derry City Football Club, for instance. He was very active in all sorts of community organisations and sports organisations and that. And he was a sergeant, I think, in the Enniskillings, on duty in Dublin during the Rising. And the tradition, although I don't know the actual evidence for it, is that he was amongst the party that arrested Patrick Pearse. Henry Nichols, or he sometimes uses the Irish form, Henry McNichol. Harry was born in Derry. He went to Trinity and he did engineering, and he was an engineer at Dublin Corporation. And his brother was George, or Saoirse. Both of them were very involved in the Irish language and the Irish movement. But they were Protestants. They were members of the Church of Ireland. And famously, Harry attended a service in St. Patrick's Cathedral wearing his Irish Volunteers uniform on St. Patrick's Day 1916. Now that must have been amazing. The church would have been packed with people in British Army uniform, and there's him in his Irish Volunteers uniform. So the two brothers, Harry and Saoirse, or George, were strongly Irish nationalists. But their brother Billy, or William, was a lifelong unionist, and indeed he would have said himself an imperialist. And he was fighting in the British Army during the First World at the very same time that his brother was taking part in the Rising in Dublin. And Harry, they said that Harry was the only graduate of Trinity College that actually fought in the Rising. And he took part he was involved in the Rising in St. Stephen's Green and the College of Surgeons and that area of the city.
My uncles, Bernard and Patrick, had like a conflict of interests in the fact that Bernard would have been like for the Rising and Patrick would have been more to think about joining the army. I know that they sort of drifted apart over the Troubles at the time.
My grandfather, Austin, was the first on that side of the family to come here. He had joined up with the Royal Scots Fusiliers when the war broke out in August 1914. And he was a bandsman. He was posted to Errington, which is how he met my grandmother, who was a local here from Gallagher, from Foyle Road. He went off to war several times, came back, and then he stayed in the army when the war ended, stayed in the Labour Corps. And he came back here then in 1920 and was working for a boot manufacturer in William Street. And I don't know what religion his father had been. His mother had been Jewish, but he obviously was non-Catholic, and he was taking instruction then to convert to Catholicism. So he and my grandmother were living in a house in Bond Street, on the other side. They were intimidated out of that and moved to a house in Cross Street, on the other side of Glendermot Road. And he was taking instruction in St. Colum's Church on Chapel Road to make his confirmation as part of his process of conversion. And he was harassed a few times by Protestant hecklers, whatever. And then eventually in June 1920, he was walking home one night with his brother-in-law, and he was shot dead from Bond Street by a sniper. And it was just because of his religion.
John joined the army and lost his life in Luce in France on the 21st of January 1916. His name is on the memorial in the Diamond, and it's also in Menin Gate. I visited it a number of years ago with the Peace and Reconciliation group. The fact that he wasn't spoken of was supposedly because his father didn't want it, and they would have been very obedient to father's wishes at that time, particularly because, as far as I know, Manassas was a very strong character, as were a lot of the people, men and women in that family. I don't think it was a feeling of disgrace. I don't think it was. I think it was just the loss of a loved one is very hard to deal with, and it's sometimes easier not to say anything at all, I think.
As in Dublin and in most of Ireland, in Derry, the Rising was very unpopular. The Derry Journal welcomed the end of the Rising. You know, the Rising was not popular amongst the nationalist population, never mind the unionist population. So it was the IRB and the people like that, the Irish volunteers that were involved, were a tiny minority within a tiny minority within a tiny minority. But the received wisdom is what really changed the situation, was the execution of the leaders. And that's what Pearse predicted. That's what they said. They were going out to kind of, to make a show that would change things. They knew themselves that military victory was impossible, but that the very striking would awaken something. Home rule was on the statute book, but it's very hard to know. But I think certainly had the executions not happened, it would be a very different situation. How different is hard to know.